Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Vortex, where lies and falsehoods are trapped and exposed. I'm Michael Voris. It's almost impossible to be involved in the church, believing, caring, concerned, without being plugged into affairs in the world. Venerable Archbishop Fulton Sheen called the world the theater of redemption. While we are not of the world, we are certainly in the world, and that imparts a duty, an obligation to be involved in the work of evangelization. And that means a sufficient grasp of the world, what's going on, how it intersects with the faith. It's vital, especially in these days of such tumult and confusion. It's why Church Militant is so adamant that faithful Catholics are aware of what's going on in the church, the culture, politics, all of it. You have to be informed and be knowledgeable. That's why at the end of each quarter of the calendar year, we bring you a summary of the major stories Catholics should know and should understand. For today's Vortex, we're going to present the major stories with analysis from this just past first quarter. Good evening and welcome to Church Militant's Winter News Wrap-Up, where we give you the news and discussion on the most important stories in the Catholic world for the first quarter of 2023, which is now over. I'm Michael Voris. Joining me at the desk today is Brad Eli, and our Rome correspondent, Dr. Jules Gomez, will be weighing in shortly on two of his biggest stories from the Vatican. Brad, take it away.
You know, this is a great opportunity to look back on 3 months. If you wait all year, you lose all of that development and all of that insight that you have gained over the last 3 months. What we're trying to do here, a takeaway for the audience, is to connect some dots, some trends, look at where things are right now and what is developing right now in the news as far as the Catholic interest. Where do we go from here? What can we expect probably in the second quarter? Each quarter has its own winter, spring, summer, fall, has its own emphasis. Where are we at right now? And kind of gathering up. We have that time to do that right now, and I think that's an important thing. Taking a quick look back over the first 3 months of the year.
Sure, you're going to take a pause and say, where are we right now?
Yep. Let's start by looking at a few men of the church who we've lost. First, of course, Pope Benedict XVI. Although he died December 31st, his controversial funeral was held on January 5th. The late pontiff, unlike the present one, cherished and championed the traditional Latin Mass. Now, the Vatican seemingly snubbed him by omitting the traditional Eucharistic Prayer 1, from his funeral Mass. It was the first time this Roman canon was not prayed at the funeral of a pope, get this, since the 7th century. Another great one was Austria's Cardinal George Pell, who passed on January 14th. He was on the Pope's original Council of Cardinals, the Gang of Nine they called it, until he got sidelined and spent time in prison based on a grave miscarriage of justice. Shortly before his death, he voiced grave concerns about the Francis papacy and the upcoming Synod on Synodality. Now, the third loss was a salty friend of many Catholics, including Church Militant. On January 19th, Catholic investigative journalist George Neumeyer died of malaria in Africa's Ivory Coast while investigating, the decline of Catholicism on the continent. God rest his soul. He investigated and exposed homosexual predation in the Catholic hierarchy and corruption in American politics. And just this week, Church Militant lost yet another friend and soldier, Catholic convert, lay evangelist, and Marian catechist Larry Ford. Many knew him by his YouTube channel, Joe Sixpack, the Cantankerous Catholic.
That's quite a staggering list in just the first quarter.
You know,
more than one a month, and every one of those guys, obviously Pope Benedict and Cardinal Pell, are on sort of their own stratosphere. But George Neumeyer and Larry, Joe Sixpack, were very good friends to this apostolate and very much engaged in the exact same type of work we do. We used to compare notes all the time. We interview each other all the time. That is a deep, deep loss, and particularly speaking in the world of journalism, George's death. That's really left a gaping hole.
It did.
It's really left a gaping hole. There are so very few Catholic sites that actually do anything that amounts to investigative work. We're obviously one of them. George did his as well, but the difference was he was able to, because he didn't do exclusively Catholic work, he'd be able to have much of his work published in the Spectator, and touching on sort of the overlap between Catholic stuff and political stuff and cultural stuff. But a great friend, very, very, very sorely missed.
We would call him a gumshoe reporter, and that really, I mean, he would hide out behind the dumpster to pop a question to Bishop Worrell or Cardinal Worrell as he's coming by. You know, that type of moxie is really missing amongst the current crowd of journalists. You know, we all kind of look for our stuff online and, you know, don't want to call someone too many times because we don't really want to upset them. And George, he just had that ability to be very, I wouldn't say confrontational, but very out there, up front, you know, just, you know.
Well, it was confrontational. It was confrontational in a way that you have to be in this business.
Exactly.
You have to confront people. He was never rude.
Right.
I mean, I was on George with, you know, at least one sting that I can sting, one, ambush in Rome. As a matter of fact, I called him and said, hey, guess who's sitting here? And he came rushing over late on a Sunday night. And, you know, I watched him do that. So it wasn't, it was certainly confronting. It was Tobin and Sean O'Malley and McElroy, before McElroy was a cardinal. And he was certainly confronting of them, but it wasn't done in a rude way. It wasn't saying, hey, fatty, or you suck. There was none of that sort of thing. But, you know, he was an absolute professional, and he understood where the stories, you know, were, what the causes of them were. Larry Ford, Joe Sixpack, while he wasn't necessarily doing his own investigative work like that, he was very quick to want to amplify others' work, George's, ours, and, you know, keep pointing at the problems in the church. It's interesting on that sort of local level or regional level in the world, in the universal church, if you want to think of it that way. That was something of what even Cardinal Pell was doing. And he finally, I don't want to say woke up and he had to go through all that horrible, you know, false charges of sex abuse and stuff, which the Australian Supreme Court finally said, this is garbage, get out of here. But when he came back, he was already, before that happened, which as many people speculate is the reason those charges came up, he was already stumbling on the evil with regard to the Vatican finances, which is what Pope Francis had put him in to do.
Right.
So you wonder, well, was Pope Francis, you know, putting somebody in there to cover himself, and so he could say we're doing it? Did he find stuff that Francis didn't know about? Did he find stuff Francis did know about? Who organized that whole thing about all of a sudden when he's getting close to the money problems, all of a sudden these false sex abuse charges come up and sideline him from that? So he came back in his remaining few months there. He was like, this is the church is a dumpster fire right now, and I got to call it out.
One of the things I hope every cardinal will read the letter from Pell on Demos. The Demos letter came out March of last year. What we have to do to elect a good pope coming forward.
Yeah.
And the decisions before them. That letter should be read by all the cardinals.
It is quite the mess right now. Absolutely. Brad, thanks. Now we're going to head to Rome, where just last week Pope Francis made new additions to his decree on sex abuse. In 2019, the Holy Father released the preliminary version of his motu proprio, Vos estis lux mundi, translated as You are the light of the world. The final version, released just last weekend, introduces and updates the category of vulnerable person to vulnerable adult. This is very key. It also addresses lay leaders of Catholic organizations who perpetrate or cover up sex abuse. That's another key point. Observers say this is because Francis's close friend, Father Marco Ivan Rupnik, was outed after abusing at least 25 nuns who could be considered, under these new terms certainly, vulnerable adults. And celebrity lay Catholic Jean Vanier, the founder of the L'Arc community, sexually exploited at least 25 women on his own. But critics say the update, which has taken 4 years to materialize, still fails to tackle the root cause of sex abuse, endemic homosexuality in the clergy. Father Rupnik still remains unpunished. So joining us now live from Rome, Dr. Jules Gomez, our Rome correspondent. Jules, what's your take on all of this? I mean, certainly the updates are good.
Michael, we've been following the Rupnik story like nobody else. And if, we can toot our horn here, Anybody who's interested in knowing the ins and outs of the Rupnik case can look at Church Militant, and there is no more extensive coverage of Father Marco Ivan Rupnik than you will find at Church Militant. Now, Pope Francis's update and definitive version of this new decree, or rather the decree that was first promulgated in 2019, is significant, but it's almost a joke here in Rome when you talk to people, because they say it's a paper tiger without teeth. Most importantly, of course, is because Rupnik has not yet been disciplined. In fact, it was the Holy See that lifted his excommunication, directly intervened to lift his excommunication. Also, if this decree were to be enacted, the irony is that Pope Francis himself would have to resign under these terms and conditions, precisely because he has been covering up for a number of celebrities, if I may use that word, clerical sex abusers. And of course, the most famous until Rupnik came along has been Gustav Zanchetta, Bishop Gustav Zanchetta, abusing seminarians, homosexual abuse. But as you rightly pointed out in your report, what the big gap here is that the elephant in the vestry, that is, of course, the endemic homosexual, prevalence in the priesthood, sorry for that tautology, is totally missing here. And seminarians who are openly homosexual, who have married civil partners, and I have reported on these stories, continue to be admitted to the Holy Priesthood, despite Pope Benedict, yes, who very clearly and emphatically said this should not be the case.
It's interesting, Jules, one of the things that you just mentioned there, it's a cool point, and certainly worth highlighting. Under these new updated guidelines of what is the final one, he would have to, Pope Francis would have to resign because of violating them. I'd like to remind the audience that we have twice issued video statements way back, even before all the theological craziness began, for this very reason, saying Pope Francis should resign. Caused quite a stir, and people were like, oh, blah, blah, blah. I said, look, we're not criticizing the Pope on theology stuff or his role, his jurisdiction or anything. We're saying that he's violating his own standards and has to go.
You know, too, Jules, it takes 4 years, and I want to put into context for the audience, 4 years to come up with vulnerable adults should also be added. We, in 2018, were saying seminarians are the ones McCarrick is abusing. Seminarians are the ones Zanchetta and all these creepies are Penapera and all these guys are going after. It's the vulnerable seminarians. You know, when we're talking about the Weinstein thing and a Me Too crowd in Hollywood, that was the whole point of the 2018, and it took them 4 years to add vulnerable adult. It wasn't about kids anymore.
Yeah, it hasn't been about kids in that sense the way it was for a while, but it's still this constant stuff. Jules, thank you very much for joining us, and you keep us updated on all this.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Brad.
All right, God bless.
The sex abuse scandal surrounding Jesuit celebrity artist Father Rupnik continues to rock the Eternal City. Last month, 15 new victims came forward to testify against the predator priest. Rupnik had already been accused of sexually abusing at least 20 nuns. When an Associated Press reporter asked Pope Francis if he lifted the excommunication imposed on Rupnik, the Pope's reply was ambiguous. In January, a nun revealed how Rupnik repeatedly demanded threesomes from her with another sister and forced her to have oral sex with him. Apologies for all the graphics. But the Jesuit-run Pontifical Gregorian University fired Rupnik. But the Knights of Columbus are using his mosaics to promote a novena to St. Joseph for the 10th anniversary of Pope Francis' pontificate. You know, you just can't make this stuff up, Jules. Just how, on a scale of 1 to 10, how catastrophic is this situation with Rupnik in your estimation?
I've repeatedly said that this is the biggest scandal of the Francis pontificate. And I talk to Jesuits on a regular basis. Boy, they are ashamed, because they say this is catastrophic for the Jesuit order as well. The Jesuit order has almost, and again, some of them tell me this is what Jesuits simply don't want to talk about, especially here in the Jesuit Curia in Rome. The Jesuits have almost halved in numbers, and people don't want to join the order. And now they have a mascot like Rupnik to advertise for them in a sense. But it's also catastrophic on a number of other levels, because it shows that Pope Francis and the hierarchy have absolutely no regard for religious sisters who have consecrated their lives to live a life of virginity for the service of the gospel. And that is the biggest irony here. And we've had, and again I've covered this, we've had a sister, the Gregorian, an African sister, who's talked about the abuse of nuns. She's published her doctoral thesis recently. I've reported on 2 Indian nuns who have written 2 books on the abuse of nuns. I've talked about how 26 nuns over the last 25 years have committed suicide in India, hanging themselves from ceiling fans, throwing themselves into a well, slitting their wrists, throwing themselves under the train on railway tracks. And yet, nothing is done. I mean, this seems to be, beyond belief, because they're just looking the other way when we talk about this major scandal.
This is kind of the classic case, Jules, that if you were to actually write this as some sort of screenplay and then bring it to some Hollywood producer or studio or something to actually make a movie, they would laugh you out of the room and saying nobody would believe this. I mean, suicides and the stuff that you broke at the end of last year about the cardinal and Gracias in India and covering. I mean, we had the goods on him on a recorded phone call, plotting with another abusive bishop, same thing, rape and everything, and just plotting with them to make sure the media didn't find out about it. I mean, it's unbelievable. And again, I don't think you hear all of this, and I mean, I think we say quite a lot around here. You write something and you're like, did I just write that? Or you say something, you say, did I just say that? Did those words just come out of my mouth?
Absolutely. I mean, I've not yet written the story, but Cardinal Gracias' auxiliary bishop, John Rodrigues, has now been elevated to the suffragan see of Pune. And he was the guy who was made in charge of the case involving Father Johnson, who brutally raped a 12-year-old altar boy in Bombay. And Father Johnson is now behind bars, but the diocese spent millions of Indian rupees paying the best criminal lawyer in Bombay to defend Father Johnson.
It's just stunning, Jules. I gotta wrap you up there. We're running out of time, but yeah, like I said, sometimes Absolutely. You can't even believe you're reporting some of this stuff. Jules from Rome, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael and Brad, again.
All right, and staying in the Eternal City, on February 21st, a rescript was published by the Vatican, further escalating Pope Francis's crackdown on the traditional Latin Mass. It declares bishops must receive approval from the Holy See for the use of parish churches and the possibility of establishing personal parishes for groups celebrating according to the 1962 Missal and the use of the 1962 Missal by priests who were ordained after July 16, 2021. Now, in response to that, Rhode Island Bishop Thomas Tobin said, quote, "The way the Vatican is dealing with the traditional Latin Mass does not seem to me to be the style of God," his words. Pope Francis himself has emphasized that those who are attached to the TLM should be accompanied, listened to, and given time. But the Vatican seems determined, at least some of them in there, to push forward full steam ahead. Dr. Joseph Shaw of the International Una Voce Federation even stated, quote, We have heard from multiple sources that the dicastery had made it clear to bishops that asking for permission for newly ordained priests, again, that's after July of 2021, to celebrate the 1962 Missal will be refused. We also know that some bishops have asked permission and been refused. So bishops and priests. Cardinal Gerhard Mueller called the regulations, quote, pastorally counterproductive. This is a really sore spot. I think part of the reason this is going sort of under the radar is that compared to so many people, Catholics throughout the world, 98 or plus % of Catholics do not attend the TLM, and huge numbers of them aren't even really aware of it. So this assault, I suppose you could call it, on this, what amounts to sort of a small, very faithful, but small group of Catholics, doesn't really get a lot of ink, because just a lot of people don't even know what it is.
Not the style of God, but really not the style of Francis whatsoever. From the time he came in, he's talking about smell like the sheep, go to the peripheries, listening church. There's not a lot of listening going on here. Now, it's ratcheting it up a bit, because you're not even allowing the bishop to do what he is generally allowed in his own sphere of given the authority to do, which is what we understand in canon law has been given, to be the head legislator in the diocese, the head liturgist in the diocese. And he has to actually go to Rome and say, I'm the bishop of this diocese, but I want permission to use this parish in my own diocese. That's never been heard of before.
It's one of the things interesting, Vatican II, that was one of the major complaints of the bishops, that there was this centralized power in Rome with everything. I'm not talking about the dogma and the teachings of the church, but that Rome had developed over the centuries this kind of, particularly after Vatican I, but even before that, this kind of authoritarian, boom, you can't do anything without us, and if it takes 5 years for your letter to get to me, oh well. And so here we are, one of the major complaints as far as the administration of the church on the part of bishops is we're kind of like right back to where we were, in 1960.
Oh, yeah, and you can have Pachamama worship going on, and not to nick on that so much, but I'm just seeing the idea that almost anything goes when it's organic, when it's wanted by the people, when this is the way they do it. This whole accommodation, enculturation type thing does not apply to the church's own culture, which has generated over for centuries and centuries or millennia. So it's really, really off target, and it really doesn't allow this whole synod on synodality, that's the buzzword all over the place.
Sure.
It's such a counter to that.
Yeah, it is. I mean, you just have a listening church and listen and listen. And on this regard, there ain't no listening going on.
No discussion whatsoever. It's amazing, but that's the way Rome is right now. And the final thing on that, though, we still need to stay within the church. We still need to. Remember, such as a church that we had, local church here in Detroit, we didn't have the TLM, all under MITA and for all that time, and only recently we're allowed that under Benedict, and now it's gone again. So we haven't really lost any more than we had before. We got to remember there's an arc of Peter that you got to stay on no matter what.
Yeah, even if you don't like the guy.
Right. Pope Francis' Synod on Synodality is getting slammed by prelates around the world. As mentioned earlier, the late Cardinal Pell was one of those critics. Right before his death, he wrote, "The Catholic Synod of Bishops is now busy constructing what they think of as God's dream of synodality. Unfortunately, this divine dream has developed into a toxic nightmare," end quote. Hong Kong's Cardinal Joseph Zen also added his voice to the chorus of concern, warning, "I fear that the Synod is repeating the same mistake of the Dutch Church 50 years ago when the bishops backtracked and accepted the faithful to lead the church. Then their number decreased." And Brussels, Emeritus Archbishop André Joseph Leonard had this to say: "The intentions of certain editors or experts there may have been at times a deliberate ambiguity, which then allowed for a tendacious interpretation," end quote. I love how they're subtle and soft with all these statements, but if you actually read them, they're pretty harsh. Many other prelates have voiced their worries, including the Polish bishops, who cautioned that synodality should not, quote, "succumb to the temptation to build some other church." And that's very important here. When we're listening church, it seems like we're always listening to the lowest common denominator elements. You just sort of believe in God somewhere out there.
I just put this in perspective for the viewers who may not have been able to follow all of this on sort of the granular level. Much of that agenda was set by these so-called listening sessions and surveys that were sent out, and it turns out that the vast majority, first of all, very, very few people actually answered them. Of that tiny little group that did answer them, large numbers of those people don't even go to Mass. So it's really hard to say that paint it as we're listening to the people of God. Well, first of all, no, you're not. You sort of set the agenda, and two, the people who responded to the agenda don't really believe everything about the church they need to do. Their ecclesiology is like shot through with a machine gun.
Right.
But I think one thing interesting is while all of this is horrible, sometimes you've got to clean house. Sometimes you have just got to stop and say, as the church, any government or whatever, but you've got to say, all of this is going on under the surface, and it's got to be gotten rid of. And it sounds to me like when the synod, part one of the synod, happens in October in Rome, and then part two a year from then, that there's some bishops coming there loaded for bear. They are ticked at all of this, and I don't think they're going to. During the synods on the family, extraordinary synod and the regular synod that we covered in person there for a while, there was a lot of politeness. There was a lot of kind of, oh, well, perhaps that's not the best way to do it. These guys are not. They don't seem that they're going to be showing up in Rome in a few months saying, oh, let's be polite. They're not going to be uncharitable, but they're going to be pretty direct is what it sounds like.
Even at the Synod on the Family.
Good.
Even at the Synod on the Family in 2015, 2014, the midterm relatio and all that type of stuff,
yeah.
We still, it's true, it wasn't as blatant as now, but we still had that inkling that same idea that we're allowing all the heretics to come out and speak.
Right.
All the dissident bishops to come out and really lay it out all on the line. And really we're encouraged to do that, from Casper and all the way on down. And we were talking about at the time that's allowing all of that stuff to come out from underneath, out of the closet, so to speak. And what Pius X actually talked about, this modernism going underground. I haven't killed it, but it's still there. It's going to rise, and someone's going to deal with it in the future. Right. Well, it's getting dealt with now. It's actually, where all the people are. They feel empowered, like McElroy.
Sure they do.
To come out and just say inclusive, gay this and homosexual, and we can ordain anybody's, whatever. And that allows everybody to see where's it all stacked. Where's everybody on this?
Yeah, you see what uniform everybody's wearing.
Oh, absolutely.
And I don't know that maybe as recently as 4 or 5 years ago that was all that clear. Certainly clearer than it had been under, for example, John Paul or even Benedict in his early days of his reign. But the cards are on the table. There they are. Nobody's wondering, does Cardinal McElroy think this or so? What about Cardinal Farrell? Is there a possibility? Nobody's wondering anything anymore. It's right there. As my mom used to say, God love her, never leave a room having people wonder what you meant. Yeah. Well, here we are. I don't think anybody's sitting around wondering what any of these players on either side are saying, thinking, or the whole bit. I would imagine that this will be the beginning of a big throwdown in Rome. And on that level, I think that's good. And it's horrible that all this stuff exists, but if it does, this is a very good way to start duking it out over it.
It was Father Bucks that came out and said that that's the same thing. All these people will be actually coming out now and having to decide. It's too far even for liberals. It's a bridge too far even for liberals. Yeah. And they don't want to go there.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, Brad. Germany's synodal way, shipwreck, has been a source of contention throughout Germany and the church at large. But on February 22nd, 4 female participants walked out, condemning the heterodox direction Germany's synodal way was headed. 2 of the women are theology professors, the third a philosopher, and the fourth a journalist. That's a nice combination there. They released a statement declaring they would no longer participate in the dissident synodal way and clarified the church in Germany is moving further and further away from the universal church. In March, at its final convocation, participants voted that priests who blessed same-sex unions will not be disciplined. There's the green flag to go ahead and do it. They also voted to bless civilly remarried divorcees and to allow women to preach during Mass. African Catholic representatives who objected to these radical innovations were snubbed by the Bishop of Essen, who retorted, quote, I consider us a universal church to be so interculturally diverse that we have to say at this point that we have to answer it differently in our country than elsewhere. Oh, how truly universal of him. Bishop Joseph Strickland of Tyler, Texas, has called on the president of every bishops' conference in the world to condemn the 38 German bishops over their recent vote, while Cardinals Raymond Burke and Gerhard Mueller have called for those bishops to undergo a canonical trial. A trial would be, that's on a good day. These guys need to be excommunicated and thrown out.
That was a great conversation Mueller and Burke had. There was also, God bless Tyler, Texas Bishop Strickland for coming out. One of the few people that's actually looking at a dumpster fire and say, hey, we ought to put this dumpster fire out. But the problem is those guys over in Germany, the bishops over there, don't want to leave the church. They don't want. Casper's like, hey, hit the brakes here. We don't want to be excommunicated or anything. You know, stay within the church. And that's the radicals. Oh, we can do whatever we want. Oh, wait a minute.
Go.
Yeah. If they would have the decency, Martin Luther, God bless him, had the decency to leave the church.
Yeah.
These guys want to stay within and set the agenda for the entire church. Marx had come out and said that in 2015.
Yep.
Other people are saying, we want to be the future of the church. And my gosh, if that's the future, there is no future.
Yeah, there's no future, right?
And it's not their church. It's Christ's church. They're just an appendage on there that if it's dead, you cut it off.
Drop it off.
And it will happen
Sure.
if, in God's estimation, there's nothing to salvage or what can be salvaged. And we have to remember that even though the church leadership right now is not taking that firm stance in Rome against this German synodal way, there's little inklings every once in a while. You can't bless gay marriage. You know, there was a document came out in March 2022. We all thought, wow, that's a great document. And there's a little statement here and there. And then there's just nothing for a while. And then they get emboldened and pick up the torch again and run for a while.
I remember Francis even, raised the specter. He's like, yo, dudes, Germany, what are you doing?
Yeah.
This is, you can't do this.
And then after a while, you just ignore everything else going on.
Goes quiet again.
The news story, the news story, the news story that comes out, and where are you going to address and all that. And why, Pius X calls them in, they kneel down, right? Let them sit there for a while, kneel in. And then after a while, if he wants or not, he'll just remove the hat, right? Mm-hmm. Where is that type of leadership in the church? That they know that they would be called in for that type of thing. So that's going to be something we're going to see in the future. We don't know. Pope Francis was 83 now, right?
84, I think, yeah.
And it's 83, 84, so he's not going to be there forever. And the next pope coming along is going to be a Pope Francis 2.0, or you're going to have a nuclear waste dump in the Vatican, because of
Well, it's interesting. It sounds
hypersonic missile.
It sounds like maybe not for you'd like it to be for theological reasons,
right.
But it sounds like even just from a PR perspective that many of the cardinals, even some of them who are more sort of left-leaning, are kind of done with all the headlines and the constant stories
and that's encouraging.
And bad PR. They're like, oh my gosh. So
that's really encouraging.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not going to do the right thing for the right reason, we'll do the right thing for the wrong reason.
Right.
But just do the right thing here.
Yeah, there's stats coming out now that a lot of what you would call liberal bishops, cardinals, are actually saying this is just, we're not even being Catholic anymore.
Yeah.
This is too far. And that you get a lot of that. Benedict XVI also had that as a young priest coming up.
Sure.
And he said, there's the TLR de Chardin and all these crazies, Ronner and all this. And a lot of that could be sounding, in his Rorschach, they paint you a Rorschach.
Sure.
They don't finish the sentence, they don't finish the thought, they don't define their words. Supernatural, existential, and you're kind of a good guy, and you kind of see all that as a good thing. And a bad guy or like
Cosmic Christ.
Right.
I mean, that sounds wonderful.
And
what does
this
it mean?
omega point and all that.
Exactly.
So this idea that these guys, now they start to see, where's this going to? And one of the guys that called that out was Pell.
Right.
He had a little video clip saying, these guys want married priests and gay this and all that. And we were kind of like, wow, where'd you get all that? We kind of knew behind the scenes, but some of these guys, it's coming out.
Yeah.
It's coming out.
It's important that it comes out.
Moving now to the church in the U.S., one of our very own corrupt prelates, San Diego's Cardinal Robert McElroy. On January 24th, he wrote an essay in the leftist Jesuit rag, America Magazine, and that's America with a K, thank you, calling for so-called radical inclusion of LGBT people. Don't limit the letters to just that, though. By allowing unrepentant sodomites to receive Holy Communion. And he claimed, quote, the question of the ordination of women to the priesthood will be one of the most difficult questions confronting the international synods in 2023 and 2024. Well, John Paul II slammed the door on that, but it doesn't stop him. While Denver's Bishop Samuel Aquila was among one of the first bishops to respond, Springfield's Illinois Bishop Thomas Paprocki fired a massive shot back at McElroy, really an uncharacteristic thing in these days. In his article, aptly titled, Imagining a Heretical Cardinal, you don't really have to stretch your imagination too much. Paprocki called out McElroy's bad theology, saying, quote, until recently, It would be hard to imagine any successor of the apostles making such heterodox statements. Unfortunately, it is not uncommon today to hear Catholic leaders affirm unorthodox views that, not too long ago, would have been espoused only by heretics. This reminds...
I did a Vortex on that with Bishop Paprocki and chatted with him for a moment, and I just said, thank you very much for saying that.
Absolutely. It was really uncharacteristic of bishops today, but we're finding this all more and more since 2014, that it's bishop against bishop, cardinal against cardinal. And just for the people out there who may have not heard, there was an approved apparition, nothing on the fringe here, that was in Akita. And if you Google
Akita, Japan, 73.
Akita, Japan, 73, and said one of the telltale signs when you know things might be heating up in the world is when you're going to have bishop against bishop and cardinal against cardinal. In 73, that wasn't heard of.
Right.
You didn't have these statements and people rebuttaling, and Aquila and Paprocki and, you know, Cardinal Mueller and Burke and all these people.
And being public. And yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting about it is, you know, there's the difference between, you know, personalities. You can't put 100 cardinals or whatever, and a bunch of people in the curia together and think everybody's going to get along nicely. Some people just don't like other people. That's fine. They weren't disagreeing about dogma. They weren't disagreeing about the doctrine and the teachings and all that. They might have a question about how do you apply this, or, you know, is it better to do this now or do it over there first, and all that sort of thing. It's more kind of strategizing, but the mission was never at question. I was making a comment to somebody out in the media pit the other day. You know, you used to see this constant on the question of patriotism with lawmakers, particularly congressmen and senators. Most of the time, these guys were all very good about rah-rah America and the whole bit, where they were personally corrupt, you know, getting kickbacks from local manufacturers and things like that. But none of them abandoned the mission. Mm-hmm. They had their own corruption and their own vanities, but they didn't abandon the mission. And that's what you see here, which is what's very different. Bishops have always been against bishops in a certain area, like everybody is against everybody on a certain basic fallen human nature level. This is an entirely different thing we haven't seen in the church. I mean, I don't know when you could even relay back and say we've seen this before.
You know, people
doctrinally.
Well, you know, you had the Arian, you know, semi-Arians, and 90% of the bishops. That was like on one topic.
Right.
And that was like a theological debate on something that we're still ironing out in the third, fourth, fifth century here.
Sure.
Homoousion, same substance, Christ and the Father, or like substance, homoousion, one letter,
right.
They're debating.
The iota.
Here, everything is up for grabs. Yeah. Basic, common sense stuff, like ordaining women when that's been, the door's been completely closed.
John Paul shut the door on that.
And Benedict said it was shut.
Yeah, and he did it in a definitive, infallible way. He said specifically to remove all confusion. And so the people will be, I hereby make binding. The church has no authority to ordain women. I mean, that's from the Pope himself. It's over, but not for these guys.
And this idea that you can be in whatever flavor of mortal sin you want, from contraception, abortion, you know.
All of it, the whole
except
gamut.
Maybe suicide, because you're not coming back from the dead. But that's about the only thing. You can do anything else and still receive Holy Communion, because we're just going to rubber stamp it. It's really amazing, the level of blatancy and out there-ness that is going on today. But those are maybe drunken sailors on the boat. Once again, people, they're drunken sailors on the boat, but this ship can't go down. They don't have the wherewithal. It's Christ's mystical body.
Yes.
And it's just pride on their part that they say, well, if I do this, and you can't do that. You can have some people follow you who aren't firm in the faith. It makes it harder for us to evangelize people.
Sure does.
Because you get all this. That's the big fallout here. I can't reach out to somebody else and say, well, the church teaches it. Well, this bishop here says this. It's all over the news.
Yeah.
So
it remains the bark of Peter. Unlike the Titanic, this ship cannot sink.
Yeah.
It can take on a lot of water.
And it's taking on some water.
It can look like it's going to, but it's impossible.
More prayers to wake up our Lord sleeping at the bow.
Screaming. Do we have like bullhorns and those air noise things? All right. Clerical sex abuse has cost the American Catholic Church more than $4 billion. That's now approaching $5 billion. And the price just keeps going up. Since 2004, 29 dioceses have declared bankruptcy, including the Diocese of Guam. On March 17th, the Diocese of Oakland, California, announced the possibility of becoming the 30th, owing to 330 sex abuse lawsuits going back to 2020. The Diocese of San Diego, McElroy's diocese, is also considering bankruptcy to settle around 400 abuse lawsuits that have all been filed since 2019. In 2007, the diocese paid out a whopping $198 million to 144 victims, and according to McElroy, it depleted most of the diocese's assets. Now, San Diego's insurance company is suing the diocese, claiming the diocese knew a number of its clerics had, quote, proclivities towards sexual abuse of children such that coverage is precluded. Just last week, the Diocese of Rochester in New York announced it would be paying out $75 million to insurance companies and clerical sex abuse victims there. This just keeps on going. This is why the bishops fought so hard to make sure these look-back windows did not get passed by all these various state legislatures, extending the statute of limitations. It's horrible that the patrimony of the church is having to be lost because of this. I'm not saying the victims don't deserve it. That's not my point. My point is all these people, all these American Catholics, mostly sons of immigrants from 150, 200 years ago, poured their heart and soul and everything into the church, and its wealth grew and it grew and it grew, and now it's being paid off because of an unfaithful clergy.
And I'm really on the side of the insurance companies. I really am.
Absolutely.
Because the fact, if you have a car and you have theft insurance, but you left your car keys out in the middle of the street.
With a sign on saying, please take my car.
Oh, really? And then it got stolen, and it's known that you were doing this. What insurance company is going to pay for that?
Sure, absolutely.
And when you're
and why should they? In justice, why should they?
Oh, absolutely. When you so mismanage things, when you actually, there's evidence that you knew all this, you're hiding all this and moving people around and keeping them in parish. This guy had a whole rap sheet, and you went and put him in another parish. And you got a whole rap sheet there, and you put him in another parish, and you want us to pay for all that? Absolutely not. And also the parishioners. I was from Montana originally. And there was the pastor, was it Warfield, I believe, in Helena, and he came out and he says, hey, parishioners, we're $20 million in the rears here because of sex abuse stuff. Can you go ahead and cough that up?
Can you add that to us, sir?
And there was some real fireworks from the old ladies there. They were like, heck no. You guys are running this place. We put our money in here to build churches and schools and convents.
To advance the faith.
Advance the faith.
Right.
And you guys let it drip away like this when it's so obvious. So these people, and once again, this has nothing to do with the victims. They need compensation. They need all this type of stuff. But at the same time, who's supposed to be paying? And that's the bottom line of all this. The bishops themselves do not pay. The worst thing that happens, they retired, with their payment. They sell the health insurance, a car, the place they're going to live.
It's one of the things that's just so stunning about this that, when you think about the individual bishops themselves, first of all, post-McCarrick, which is coming up on 5 years, not one bishop has even come out and said they knew anything, much less resigned or anything else. There was one retired bishop, I believe he was in Minnesota, I might be wrong, but he was like 80. And he said, I actually kind of knew about all this, and I'm sorry, and I apologize, and blah, blah, but, nothing happened in that sense. None of these guys have been removed.
It's not their money.
It's not they never suffer the consequences of their decisions for all these years and all these decades. It is impossible. I was having a conversation with a bishop when we were in Baltimore, and he said to me, how do you know all this stuff you report is true? I'm like, well, I don't know. Where's your $5 billion gone out the door to? You just paying off lawsuits just to pay them off? Really? It's almost $5 billion. And they have that massive insurance interest in Omaha, the church, Catholic Mutual, that has to have billions of dollars in it. And instead of tapping that money, which is their insurance money, because they force every diocese to pay into it, religious orders, individual priests, if you're a pastor, you have to get your car insurance from that bishop's insurance company. Where's all that? Why don't you get into that? Why are you selling off properties and schools and stealing convents from nuns and all of this? Pay the price yourselves, but they never do. That's the problem. Well, not in this life anyway. They'll probably hope, I presume, when they die that they wished they had.
Justice in this lifetime is actually a gift. The seal of confession is also under attack now in Delaware, and a retired priest from the Archdiocese of Milwaukee was silenced for speaking against the seal. The Archdiocese's former Vice Chancellor, Father James Connell, wrote an op-ed for Delaware Online demanding that governments should intervene and force priests to report confessional material regarding child abuse. Well, you'd be excommunicated for doing that. The Lepanto Institute highlighted Connell's article and asked people to politely petition Milwaukee's Archbishop Jerome Listecki to intervene. And a day later, the Archbishop announced, quote, "The false assertions of Father James Connell have caused understandable and widespread unrest among the people of God, causing them to question if the privacy of the confessional can now be violated by him or any other Catholic priest. I have informed Father James Connell that effective immediately, he is to cease all such erroneous communications that distort the teachings of the Church about the confessional seal. I have also immediately removed the canonical faculties of Father Connell to validly celebrate the sacrament of confession and to offer absolution." You know, it's always amazing. We get these stories every so often, you know, whether it was in Louisiana some years back, the state was talking about that. Also in Australia, you know, you get these commissions that want to do away with the seal of confession. And I'm always kind of uplifted by the response, the firm response by leaders that no matter how bad it is, no matter how many things they waffle on, no matter what they're talking about out there, what they're not standing up for, they at least stand up for the seal of confession. I find it kind of reassuring that they do that. I mean, there's a lot of pressure, and it keeps going back to that seal.
Sure it does, yeah.
But if there is a seal of confession and you just can't, you know, no one's going to go, I'm not going to,
In a pluralistic society, what would be the, and people don't understand the faith, heck, even many Catholics who don't understand the faith, what would be the rationale out there in the media world, in the secular media world, what would be the rationale for somebody that somebody would be watching saying, why do these bishops just not want to say, really, you want to protect little kids getting sexually abused because of some religious right? That's how it plays out on Main Street in America, and that's actually how it plays among some Catholics as well. So, yeah, absolutely true that. There has to be, you know, a standing up in this. The problem is that your lack of inaction up to this point, it's like your firewall. Okay, that's the line too far. No, the line too far was all this stuff you've allowed to go on for 50, 60, 70 years. That was the line too far. Now it's coming back to you. I often wonder, I mean, maybe it's just because I'm a skeptical journalist and that's kind of part of my nature, but I often wonder also that if the seal was allowed to be broken, how many bishops would actually have stuff being reported or said about them or other priests? You know, is that part of the motivation here? I hope not, but I mean, given the current dumpster fire we're in, I just don't think it's something that can be off the table. If they said, oh, we're going to just break the seal, and priests just go up there who don't believe the faith, some of them anyway, and they just say, yeah, imagine what would come out in a court in some of these matters.
Well, two things. One, it's kind of a moot point anyway, because very few people go to confession. I mean, on a regular basis, it just doesn't happen very often right now. Number two, people who are out there abusing and all this, will they really, are they that in tune with, you know, haven't lost their faith already if you're abusing people? But I would like to touch upon one guy that probably gamed the system a little bit, a bishop, cardinal actually, Worrell.
Yeah.
He was the guy who would hear the confessions of all these guys, especially the homosexual crowd in there. And I'm wondering if he didn't do it so that he could go claim, seal a confession. Oh, I heard this guy's confession. I can't bring anything up there, you know, too close to it. I wonder if, and I thought about that when that story first surfaced some years ago.
Yeah.
About him being involved with that. And I thought maybe he's gaming the system that way, just to have that ability to say, oh, I can't. And he made a point of hearing those type of confessions. Maybe he was trolling the confessional too. Hey, yeah, you do this type of thing, call me later, we'll have spiritual direction. You know?
We have a number of cases that we're aware of, we can't report on yet, but this very thing that, you know, younger men who have, I'm speaking with them, have gone into confession and, you know, confessed something and then been hit on by the priest.
Isn't that something?
So, you know, it's very, very disturbing. I actually called somebody who is very knowledgeable of all of that, and they said that is so many canon laws being broken, you don't even know where to begin.
Wow.
Another troubling case is that of Frank Pavone, the director of Priests for Life, who was laicized by Pope Francis in November last year. Since then, there have been very troubling accusations of boundary violations with various young women, made by various young women. On January 25th, Church Militant reported multiple witnesses, including 2 priests, are confirming that Frank Pavone, head of Priests for Life, has been accused by multiple women of boundary violations. Father Stephen Imbarato, a former associate with the organization, told Church Militant, quote, PFL, meaning Priests for Life, did not have a human resource department providing recourse to aggrieved employees, nor a safe, independent, and confidential harassment committee. This has always been a very it's a very touchy subject, this, with Priests for Life, and, who knew what, when did they know it? We have some information that payoffs were made, but they were not made in kind of the traditional manner where the board of directors would have approved an NDA, non-disclosure agreement. There's also that, Father Frank Frank Pavone has not come out and actually denied all of this. He's just said, well, those things are all kind of taken care of, which, okay. And it's not to throw, Pavone under the bus. I think I've said to people plenty of times, I went to seminary in the 80s with Pavone in New York. Nice guy, I've always liked him, all of that stuff, but that's not the issue. The issue is, when people were donating money to the cause, was their money, some of the money, siphoned away to handle these complaints and that sort of thing? Aside from the actual complaints themselves, those are bad, but was money taken out of the organization by some people in that organization to just kind of make these things all go quiet and go away? It appears so far that the answer to that is yes. Even if it's not a resounding yes, it seems to be the case. And what has happened in the Catholic media world before all of that stuff was completely known, you had various Catholic media outlets jumping all over sort of the bandwagon. Oh, Father Pavone, got to save the, the Pope is wrong on this and this and all this, and the bishops, and screw them, and we're going to go gather, names and petitions and make sure the holy priest is restored and all that. And it's like, dudes, you don't get to hold yourself out, put your shingle up as though you're reporting news, but then not do the hard work that's involved in it. You misled people. And now there's this air of confusion around all of this. So that's not good. Catholic media should never be making things confusing. They should be making it clear.
I was here for 9 years, and that was one of the stories that I think helped me kind of identify in journalism. And, you had that whole push, immediately response. Hey, Church Militant, why aren't you reporting this or reporting on a favorable light? And everybody else is reporting on this in a favorable light. And how Church Militant actually did know things behind the scenes. We're talking to different people behind the scenes, and really had some discussions there about what level of support right off the bat, because it turned out that was misplaced if there was any support. So trying to report things in a fair way, and at the same time not make any assumptions of somebody's guilt or innocence, but still report it in a fair way, while everybody else was just making massive assumptions that it's all just, wrong, and Pavone's the victim here and everything else.
Yeah, and this is one of the problems that's wrong with Catholic media today, Catholic media on the right, if you want to call it that there's this, jump on the bandwagon, do whatever the cause celebre is. It fits our narrative that, we're right, everybody else is wrong. Anybody who runs afoul of the institutional church, a priest, is immediately a holy priest. That's not true. That's simply not true. We know a number of examples of things like that. And just because a priest is kicked out or is facing being kicked out or anything like that, that doesn't mean that he is a victim of some diabolical, awful thing and the evil church is getting rid of a good, holy man. In some cases, that's the case. In other cases, it's not even close. And those things have to be looked at. That's why we may appear to sort of drag our heels, moving on some stories and jumping on certain people's bandwagons, but the reason we don't is because there's oftentimes more to the story, and it's irresponsible. It's irresponsible for these other, Catholic, individuals and celebrities on the internet and all that stuff to just jump onto something and not be true. They eat crow on humble pie, and they confuse all sorts of people because not everybody hears everything they say. Don't say if you don't know.
Well, finally, for our last news story tonight, we can't skip over how Church Militant made it into the news. On February 9th, an internal Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, memo was leaked online targeting so-called radical traditionalist Catholics, RTC ideology. 9 organizations were mentioned on the last page of that report, but on page 4, Church Militant was specifically named. It claimed, this memo, that open source reporting and FBI investigations have noted a growing overlap between the far-right white nationalist movement and RTCs. Illustrative of this has been the increasing collaboration of the far-right Catholic media outlet, Church Militant. end quote. Both secular and...
It's kind of news to us, by the way.
Wow. on a FBI report, man. Both secular and conservative media complained the memo was a violation against free speech. But of course, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and the Vatican made no response. The Federalist Evita Duffy Alfonso wrote, both the Vatican and the USCCB have become complicit in U.S. government attempted persecution of traditional Christians. They don't want to upset their supposed allies on the political left by defending their Christian brothers on the right. Indeed, they likely share in the left's disdain for them, end quote. After a week, the USCCB responded, but only condemned the, quote, troubling and offensive memo after mentioning racism and violence. You know, that was really something. This first quarter of 2023 kind of came with a bang. And I have to tell people, okay, right here, this all goes back to Church Militant connecting culture and politics and religion, which is what we do because of the fact that we are who we are. That's what we do, that the triangle there. Religion, politics, and culture is a natural triangle to look at. That's our viewfinder.
Yeah, that's our wheelhouse.
And we looked at that during the Trump administration, during the Trump campaign.
Yep.
And for some reason, because we did that, we also helped, I think, turn some Catholics onto Trump, at least exposing how they were played by the left. You know, Hillary's campaign.
Podesta.
Podesta, right. I read your emails, the WikiLeaks and all that stuff that came out. Yeah. Anyway, it showed how Catholics were played, and we reported that. Our site broke a few times because of all that. But the left, the media then came out strong against us. New York Times and even Spadaro's arm. And,
we did an entire special on all of
that coming out against us. That's where this is the last car to pile up right there. The left just hasn't gotten over the fact that somehow, some way we might have helped Trump get into the presidency, and they just say, you guys are dangerous because of that. And therefore, and they use the discredited SPLC, Southern Poverty Law Center's memo, directing us, hey, yeah, look at these guys.
Yeah, these guys are
bad.
That
was completely beyond the pale. FBI, you're following SPLC?
And really? What's funny is inside the FBI, there is a declaration to not use them.
Yeah.
Because they're not verified, they're nothing. It's just a political activist group that essentially raises money producing a hate list. And then once they produce the hate list, they say, hey, give us some money so we can, tell you more hate list. And it just gives this cycle. All they do is raise money telling people, hey, these people hate people.
Yeah.
You guys hate people.
Well, we came up on the memo, and that memo was circulated around all the servers and all the FBI outfits. And the only reason it came out, was not in place still today, or it probably is, but because of a whistleblower said, hey, this is really beyond the pale here. Now, on two levels. One, you're targeting Catholics, and two, you're actually using people like SPLC to do your that's not investigation.
Yeah.
That's like us looking up WikiLeaks or Wikipedia. Wikipedia says this and run the whole story, and then our money quote is Wikipedia, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? It's worse than that even.
Yeah.
So Josh Hawley and Senator from Missouri came out strong against him, and others.
He went after in good form. He should have gone after him more in Merrick Garland in that Senate hearing. That was, tremendous. He launched a full-scale attack against him. It's great.
Yeah, well, hopefully they keep it up because the weaponization of the feds is a real thing, from IRS knocking on people's doors now and us coming up in a memo, Catholics coming up in a memo, and the FBI. It's going to be some serious times.
Yeah, it's. I think we have not even yet seen the whites of their eyes, to be honest. I still don't think those who know what they're looking for have seen it. That would be us and a few other folks. But, the bottom line is America just hasn't suffered enough.
Right.
It's going to happen. It has to, because that's what the left is trying to do. All right, just before we leave here today, we're going to ask you to join us in our prayer that we make at the end of every one of these sorts of broadcasts and evening news. Pray the Salve Regina, the Hail Holy Queen, with us, and we invite you to do that now. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Amen. Salve Regina, Mater Misericordiae, vita dulcedo et spes nostra salve. Ad te clamamus exules filiae Eve. Ad te suspiramus gementes et plentes in hac lacrimarum vale. Ea ergo advocata nostra. Ilos tuos misericordes oculos ad nos converte. Et Iesum benedictum fructum ventris tui. Nobis post hoc exilium ostende. O clemens, O pia, O dulcis Virgo Maria. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. That is all for this first quarter review of 2023 and all the news that all faithful Catholics need to know. Thank you very much for joining us. For Brad and the entire Church Militant crew and staff, God love you.